Thank you for joining us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. My name is Jon Ekstrom. I am your on-air producer. We are part of the Connect and Collaborate Network, and I am joined by our host, Chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado, Peter Moore. Peter, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Afternoon, John. How are you doing today?
Never better, Peter. Literally, never better.
Well, it's a glorious day.
It is indeed. We are blessed to have with us Rich Mignogna. And Rich, I think we can call you an energy or technology forecasting expert. Is that fair?
That's one of the areas that I spend a lot of time in, yes.
So we're going to get into a lot of interesting stuff on this week's show. But Peter, before we do that, why don't you give a little rundown of who Vital for Colorado is and what we're all about?
Vital for Colorado is a Colorado nonprofit corporation. It has been in operation for since really about the summer of 2013. We try to advocate with regard to responsible energy policy. We're not really advocating for a particular result. We're guided by a series of principles, and some of the principles are very common sense principles, such as we try to avoid conflict and people trying to put each other in opposing camps. Yep. We try to focus on the science wherever it might lead us. We want people to understand the economic input. And what distinguishes Vital for Colorado from many other organizations is that we try to be the voice of business and the voice of Colorado citizens as opposed to the voice of industry.
Right.
So our board of directors, we're run by a 15-person board of directors. We don't have any industry representatives. We're mostly chambers of commerce from the region and several presidents of businesses. And of note, and this really has surprised me how strongly this message has grown. We've, I guess, organized ourselves by a 7 principles pledge, just a one-page statement of who we are. And this pledge has now been signed by close to 87,000 Colorado citizens, including 1,000 businesses.
It's remarkable.
So we feel like we hit a responsive chord, and love talking about technology, especially love talking about think what it might be in the future. And you are the very first technology forecasting and assessment expert that I've had, and I just find the concept fascinating. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? How does somebody become a technology forecasting expert?
Well, that was a long trip, and I suppose once you get old enough, you've had an opportunity to do enough different things that they all sort of come together on you. It was a field that I developed an interest in back in my old MBA days. I started out life, or my industrial life anyway, as an engineer.
Yeah.
I worked in coal mines, worked for uranium companies, and a number of different types of energy minerals. And when I then later on went back to do business education, I quite accidentally stumbled onto a field of technology forecasting, which was a bit of an arcane, specialized field. Much of it was done by the Department of Defense in the early days. And was fortunate enough to become acquainted with some of the early workers in that field. They mentored me to some extent in that field, and I, took and developed an increasing interest. And a lot of that led to my later on work in energy and renewable energy as well.
It's interesting that you bring that up. And Peter, you brought up the 7 principle pledge.
Yeah.
One of which is we support an all of the above strategy in terms of developing our resources. So, Rich, hearing you talk about work in coal mines and uranium, I think that segues nicely into your work in renewable energy, which is going to be one of our topics of focus today.
Okay, yes.
So,
I was just going to comment, because we've had representatives of the solar industry on many times, and just because the way the energy grid works, it's really a very symbiotic type of industry, and I think there are, I would say, it's probably an overstatement to say no greater supporter, but strong supporters of the natural gas industry are the people that are in charge of the solar industry, because they recognize that they need natural gas and other forms of support from the energy grid in order to survive.
Reliable baseload power is what you're describing.
Yeah.
Well, that's an area that's undergoing constant change. Back when I worked for the Public Utilities Commission, which was from about 2005 through 2011, there was a widespread recognition that natural gas would be the alternative to solar and renewables, and there was a symbiotic relationship there. Today, that relationship is changing because energy storage has now become sufficiently cheap that it is taking the place of backup power for the renewables. So you have to look at the price of natural gas versus the price of energy storage and see which one of those is going to be most economical in the long run. Right now, it depends on the application. And so it would be incorrect to say that in all cases one is preferable to the other. You really need to look at the applications for each of these technologies.
And I was actually even more thinking of them working together as opposed to being opposed. But I do understand that it's a market economy, and technology and science changes things sometimes very, very quickly.
Yes, and it's right now we are in a period where the economics are changing rapidly, and the technology is changing rapidly, but also the politics are now beginning to enter into it as well. I don't know if you saw today, there was an announcement that the president has issued a directive to the Department of Energy to come up with a plan to save the nuclear and coal baseload plants. This was issued just today.
Interesting.
I did not see that. I saw yesterday's pronouncement to enact tariffs in steel and, as the people of my country would say, aluminium from Canada. And I said, leave the poor Canadians alone.
Rich, you mentioned working for the Public Utilities Commission, and if we could spend some time talking about that, because I think in terms of the general public, a lot of people don't understand exactly what the Public Utilities Commission does, how it works. So if we could do a little bit of 101 there, I'll start by asking you what your principal role was.
I was the renewable energy specialist. I had a title of professional engineer and senior authority on renewable energy for the staff of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission.
And you have the distinction of actually being a fiscal note, is that correct?
I was. Back in 2004, when the voters of Colorado passed Amendment 37, which created the Renewable Energy Standard in Colorado, the next thing that had to happen was that the legislature had to codify that, and that became Senate Bill, I believe, 153 in 2005. Like much legislation, that Senate bill had a fiscal note which allowed the Public Utilities Commission to hire one additional full-time equivalent engineer, which turned out to be me.
Right.
So I look at it, I was the fiscal note attached to the Colorado Renewable Energy Standard.
That's kind of cool.
I suppose.
Not everyone can claim to be a fiscal note attached to a legislative initiative.
Good and bad with that, I suppose. At any rate, so what happened then was I came onto the Public Utilities Commission staff in November of 2005. My focus was solely on renewables, although that had to dovetail with many other electric resource planning issues at the time because they can't be divorced from one another. And worked through the very first utility renewable compliance plans for the renewable standard and associated electric resource planning issues as well. So I was there for the first wind farms. I was there for the first solar farms, for the beginning of net metering and solar rewards and things like that. What I would say the public probably doesn't understand a lot about is that the Public Utilities Commission regulates only the investor-owned utilities.
Okay.
So there are three types of utilities in Colorado. There are investor-owned utilities. In the electric sector, there are two. Xcel, otherwise known as Public Service Company of Colorado,
right,
and Black Hills Energy, which serves about 90,000 customers down in the area around Pueblo, Canyon City, and so on. Then they also regulate the investor-owned gas utilities and so on. But in the electric sector, if you're not an investor-owned utility, many customers are served by municipal utilities. Fort Collins is served by a municipal utility. Colorado Springs Utilities is a municipal utility. Those utilities are regulated per se by their respective city councils.
Oh,
so they are elements of the city government there. They do not come under Public Utilities Commission jurisdiction. The other utilities that do not are what are called the co-ops, or the cooperative renewable energy associations. There are 22 of those in Colorado, serve primarily the rural areas of the state.
Would that be like IREA,
IREA is the biggest of them.
Right.
But the United Power is another one that's in the Denver area, but it could be San Miguel. They're all over. So there's 22 of them. Again, largely the rural areas. They are supervised by a board of directors. The Public Utilities Commission has no regulatory authority over them, although there is some dovetailing in terms of acquiring hardware, power plants, and so on.
That's interesting. I didn't know that the Public Utilities Commission was only over investor-owned utilities. That's interesting to me.
Yes.
In terms of a percentage of people served, do you have a sense of what Excel and Black Hills together might be? Would that be the vast majority of Colorado citizens?
It is the vast majority. It's probably about 75% of the electric load in the state.
Okay.
So the rural electric co-ops might serve, the smallest of them might serve maybe 5,000 customers. IREA, which is the largest of them, Excel, or Public Service Company of Colorado, on the other hand, serves about, I believe it was 1.3 million customers.
I always hear about the PUC in the context of rate cases, and I think of one of the main missions is to maintain reasonable rates for Colorado citizens. I'm just curious how the investor-owned, such as Excel and Black Hills, compare to the co-ops and the city-owned utilities. Is it more expensive in general, or can one not generalize that way?
I don't think you can generalize across them. Overall, Colorado is I would say a moderately priced state for electricity. We run maybe 12 cents per kilowatt hour plus or minus there. Each of the utilities then has other charges that they add to the bill. On the other hand, if you were in California, you could be paying more than twice that. If you were on the East Coast, Massachusetts might be paying 17, 18 cents per kilowatt hour. If you were in Hawaii, you might be paying 30, 40 cents a kilowatt hour.
Right.
So we're in pretty good shape here overall. We've got a lot of good resources here, and electricity is moderately priced here.
That's good. In terms of how things work at the PUC, how does, say, permitting work? Let's say Excel wants to create a new project. What boxes do they have to check? What do they have to go through? What are the steps?
Well, one of the things that's actually interesting here is permitting is probably not the proper term to use because the Public Utilities Commission does not permit power plants.
Okay.
They give the utility authorization to build and recover expenditures for a power plant.
Interesting.
The permitting itself, in terms of land use and that type of thing, is done either at the local level under what are known as 1041 regulations, or air quality permits are still needed from the state, and some other things there. So they don't get an overarching permit to build a facility, whether it's a coal plant or a gas plant or a wind farm.
And does that pertain to things like substations and power lines?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of that is done in the ordinary course of business, and so the utility does not need special permission to do it. Depends on the level of the expenditure and how it all fits into the electric system.
It seems the authority to spend is probably the first and perhaps most important authority.
It is because that's where the utility then plans its future electric needs. So every 4 years, under Colorado's rules, every 4 years, the utility is to submit its next resource plan. So there's a quadrennial resource plan that is due from the utility every 4 years. They then have to say, well, we see this much load growth, and we would like to acquire resources to meet that additional load growth. The commission typically then opens up a proceeding with that, gives them permission, tells them to go ahead and issue a solicitation. In Colorado, we've typically done this by competitive solicitations, where the utility will go out and ask for bids for wind farms, solar farms, gas plants, you name it, whatever they need. And those will oftentimes be competing against one another in terms of the cost of the energy from them. The utility will take all of those bids that come in. They will model the system and say, our system works best with this new acquisition, with this new wind farm, this solar farm, this gas plant, so on. They will then issue their preference and go back to the commission and say, our preference is for us to acquire this portfolio of new resources. The commission will then have to approve that. In that proceeding, there will be many other interveners. The staff of the commission intervenes, the Office of Consumer Counsel intervenes, anyone with an economic interest is allowed to intervene. Wow. Large industrial consumers intervene. Walmart is in there, King Soopers is in there, Climax Molybdenum is in there. And they all have their own interests at stake. So you could end up with a proceeding of 20, 25, perhaps even more interveners in there. They will all state their case, issue their preferences as well. The commission then has to make a decision on what the best outcome overall for the state is.
Wow.
And you mentioned, I guess, a few value-laden terms, the best outcome, what works best. And we've been really focusing simply on cost, but I imagine there are many other factors that also have great importance.
There are other factors. The statutes, Colorado law actually requires that the main factor be the present value of revenue requirements. Yeah. So one of the metrics that the utility has to come up with when they model their system with the new acquisitions is look at the impact on the present value of revenue requirements going out for many years into the future. But there are other considerations. There are air quality considerations. There are job considerations, and economic development, which actually don't get the same level of attention that the revenue requirements do. They're in there, but I won't tell you that they're looked at the same level. Right.
Are there aesthetic considerations? Because you and I had talked as we were prepping for this. Is there, is it appropriate to put, say, a wind farm along a ridge line if there's aesthetic value to be had there, or does that get punted to cities or counties?
The latter. That gets punted to the local folks who have to do the permitting and the land use permitting. I have never seen, at least in the time I was there and since then, any kind of a ruling from the commission that concerned aesthetic considerations for wind farms or solar farms or things of that nature. Local land use people have to deal with that. In some cases, not so very different from drilling a well, with a setback from a school or residences or something like that.
Yeah, very similar concept.
And that's done at the local level. What's interesting there is that while that is done at the local level, if you were drilling a well, the state does take supremacy over that decision for oil and gas, but only for oil and gas. So the state doesn't get involved with a setback for a wind farm. So a developer might build a wind turbine 500 feet from your home. You might have little to say about it. That would be done at the local level. Whereas, obviously, as you know, a lot of the discussion these days is what should the setback be for drilling a well.
Right.
So the state assumes primacy on one case. Interestingly, they don't take any interest in the other.
Yeah, that is unusual. It's also interesting because oftentimes it's a question of resources. In terms of at the city and county level, there's typically not a petroleum engineer on staff. There's not anyone who can weigh in meaningfully on what the resource plan is for drilling. Whereas if you're putting a wind turbine that is largely just above ground, I would say there are certainly layers of complexity, but when you start going below ground, there are different levels of expertise perhaps needed there.
That's true, and I agree that in terms of the subsurface, the level of expertise is going to be quite a bit different. Although there are a lot of considerations, I think, these days that people are bringing up in terms of health effects of being too close to a wind turbine, for example. There's a lot of discussion over the scientific merit of those
That's
issues.
a big issue in the bird community,
The health advocacy organization of birds and bats might have something to say about it.
Well, and that's interesting because it's the federal government that ends up being, because that's a wildlife issue, it's the federal government that ends up controlling much of that.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're looking at endangered species of raptors
Sure.
and things of that nature.
What kind of birds?
That's an issue, and probably we could get really bogged down there and not have a good outcome to get too lost in that discussion.
Just in terms of the net present value, I think that there's a lot even in there because you need to have income production, therefore satisfaction and demand, probably 24/7, 365 over a long period such as 50 years. And you might look at that versus an intermittent source. So how do the intermittency fit into the net present value calculation?
It doesn't directly. The utility is required to maintain a certain reliability. Generally, it's 99.9% reliability. They can't have outages of more than 1 in 10,000, 1 hour in 10,000 hours, 1 day in 10,000 days, so on and so forth. And the reliability issue is governed by the federal authorities, actually, in many cases.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, Rich, we are going to dig into this a little bit more in our next segment. We're going to talk about renewable portfolio standards, how those manifest, how they differ from state to state. We're also going to touch on some of the energy education that you do and some other topics. Peter Moore, our chairman and CEO, is our host. Rich Mignogna is our guest. Stay with us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. We'll see you here in just a minute. Thanks for staying with us here on Vital for Colorado Radio, part of the Connect and Collaborate Network. We had a great first segment with Rich Mignogna, giving us tremendous insight into how the Public Utilities Commission works. And we're going to talk some more about that in our next segment. Peter, why don't you kick it off?
Well, I was looking at all the acronyms in your business. It kind of reminds me of the of hair from many years ago. We have REA, RES, PUC, RPS. Is any of their major ones, or those are the key ones that I fit, or do you have more to offer?
No, we'll stick with those. I don't. No point in confusing everybody even further than we need to.
And if you're scoring at home, that's a bingo.
That's a bingo.
In terms of three-letter acronyms.
I think I think we covered the PUC before and have a sense of its mission and your role with it. But the renewable energy, actually, I'm looking here. I think I've lost myself. The renewable portfolio standards. I think that's an important topic.
Okay.
So let's start with that one.
And that was your reason for being at the PUC.
Right.
It was. And so the two acronyms that you're getting lost in there, one was RES and one is RPS. They're the same thing. Generically, Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, is a statute or some other obligation that requires utilities to get a certain amount of their energy from renewable facilities. RES is what we ended up calling it in Colorado for Renewable Energy Standard. It might be more appropriately called a Renewable Electricity Standard because it doesn't apply to all energy per se. It doesn't apply to heating. It doesn't apply to natural gas.
Doesn't apply to transportation.
No. So we call it the RES. In the public documents that you see, you will see the acronym RES, R-E-S, for Renewable Energy Standard. That's what it's called in Colorado. More generically, across the country, the term is RPS for Renewable Portfolio Standard, and those vary from state to state. There are 29 renewable portfolio standards, or 29 states that have a renewable portfolio standard. Each of them is different. Each of them is different in their definition of eligible renewable resources that would be allowed to be used to comply with the standard, and the percentages of the obligation. Colorado is toward the strict end with a 30% by 2020 renewable standard. California, as many people are aware, is even stricter. They need to go to 50%.
Wow.
But on the other hand, you've got some other smaller states where maybe the renewable standards is only 10%, and then you've got many states with none at all.
Has anyone crossed the Rubicon and gone to 100% yet?
Hawaii has. Hawaii has gone to 100% by 2045, so that's still very far off into the future.
Right, they've got some runway there.
They've got a lot of time before they need to get there. But if you look at Hawaii and the alternatives that are available to them, being essentially an island system, their alternative without other resources is essentially to ship in fuel oil and run diesel generators.
And you mentioned earlier that the cost to the consumer in Colorado is probably 1/3 or less than 1/3 than the cost in Hawaii.
Correct.
Because of all those transportation costs.
So that'll change the economics quite a bit as you look at renewable energy and how it's applied, given the constraints of what you're dealing with.
Yes. So you have to look at the alternatives that are available. Europe is often held out, and Germany is one of the places that's often held out as a model. And so is Denmark. Denmark was one of the first countries to go pretty big into wind energy. It was easy for them, actually, because they're backed up by Norwegian hydro.
Oh.
So, you know, the 20% renewables, 20% wind power in Denmark was actually easy to do because you've got all the Norwegian hydro to back it up. So that was not a problem. Germany, on the other hand, has taken a couple of different approaches, but Germany, we're also looking at 36 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity there, so it makes many things that would otherwise seem more expensive possible.
Somebody mentioned this to me fairly recently. I've not checked to see if it's true or not, but you might know since I think you'll be in Germany next week.
I will.
Well, is Germany needing to develop coal backup sources as we speak? That's what somebody just told me.
I thought I had read that too.
Yeah.
They've done that because of the backlash from the Fukushima nuclear accident. So Germany had many nuclear plants, about 22 nuclear facilities. which they shut down shortly after Fukushima. Well, there was no other way to meet the load than going back to some of the coal plants. And in Germany, much of that coal is actually a brown coal, which is called a lignite. It's high in CO2 emissions, and so that caused Germany's CO2 emissions to end up going up. What Germany has done for a longer term strategy is to say, well, we want to do more renewables. We'd like to go to more wind power, more solar. They were already pretty big in solar, but they want to do more of each of those. It's had some impacts on their electric grid, aside from the increasing coal use, raising their emissions. There have been grid impacts from the wind and the solar, and something that's called negative pricing. California is dealing with this right now, in which you can get a period of the day, mid-afternoon, for instance, when the sun is shining. If you have all those solar facilities, you might have a period of time when you've got more energy going into the grid than you need.
Right.
And that leads to negative pricing. In other words, a generator might pay the grid to take its energy.
Huh. Wow.
Because it's cheaper than shutting down.
It's hard to use the word irony and German culture in the same sentence, but I'm just wondering if the politicians in Germany have seen the consequences of all these decisions. Now they're building high sulfur coal plants.
It's they have, but it's political there as well, like it is here in many cases. You've got different arguments. The Chancellor Merkel is a strong proponent of renewables, but then you've got other folks who have said, we are beginning to see economic issues because of the high price of electricity.
Right. And
so you get those different camps there, much like you see here. I would say that it's not a lot different.
Well, certainly. And one of the challenges you mentioned with the grid is if you're not bundling, one of the reasons natural gas ends up bundled with wind and solar is because you can turn on and off a gas plant pretty quickly to ramp up and ramp down to meet demand, because the grid in general, without robust energy storage, can only accommodate as much energy as it needs at that particular moment.
Correct.
More or less. So if you have a lot of wind and a lot of coal, you're going to end up with an incorrect amount of energy, either too much or too little. Is it fair to say that?
Depends on the time of day, and you have to compare it to the load. So now in Colorado, we get the greatest production from the wind farms at night.
Oh.
When the load is the least.
Right.
And so you need to find a way to either store that energy or back it up. At one point in time, Xcel was able to do a lot of that with a pumped hydro plant that they have up by Georgetown called Cabin Creek. And Cabin Creek was very, very useful for managing the fluctuations. As they get to more and more wind on the system, there are going to have to be other ways to deal with that. One of the interesting things in the resource plan that I mentioned earlier that Xcel is working through right now is that they had many bids for storage combined with wind farms and storage combined with solar farms at prices that were the lowest ever seen anywhere in the country.
Wow.
And so we're waiting to see what these turn out to be.
What technology for storage? What's being proposed?
I didn't look at the individuals, but a lot of lithium battery storage, mostly battery storage of different flavors. So you can use sodium sulfur batteries. I think Xcel even has one up in Minnesota. Right. A lot of lithium seems to be the technology of choice right now, but for stationary storage, as opposed to storage that you put in an electric vehicle, for instance, for stationary storage, there is something called a flow battery, which is also turning out to be pretty useful as well. So,
I'd like to touch on something that that you had talked about, which is renewable energy standards, renewable portfolio standards. I tend to get politicized. And frequently we hear them these days in the context of combating climate change, which, as you've articulated to me, there are a number of components that go into considering how much renewables to use. Climate change and environmental concerns being one of them. What are the others?
It's interesting that you bring that up, because back when I first got into renewables, and renewable portfolio standards were promoted for a number of different benefits. One of them was the environmental issues and greenhouse gases in particular. Okay, but there were many others. Economic development was one. Conservation of scarce resources. So for every pound of coal that we did not have to use, or for every barrel of oil that we did not have to set fire to burn, we had that much available to us for some other purpose. So conservation of scarce resources was early on a big driver. And also looking at the standard as the ability to advance the new technology, because technologies will only advance so far in the lab. You then have to deploy them and actually use them and learn how they work. So those were all the issues that were involved. Today, mostly it's environmental issues that you hear about. You tend not to hear too much about the conservation of scarce resources, because as we've found, oil and gas is not so scarce, neither is coal. And those have become secondary.
I think the energy security component of that is also interesting, and that conversation is also changing.
That conversation has changed as well. Think back to the mid-1970s when there was an oil shortage, and if you're old enough, that you remember long lines at gas pumps. In Colorado, we had based on your license plate number, you could only go every other day. You're too young to remember that. Maybe you're not. But
actually, when I came here for law school in 1978, gas was the tremendous price of $2 a gallon, and nobody could afford it.
Right.
Because it had gone there from just a few years before at 25 to 40 cents.
Correct. And so,
Wow.
So energy security in terms of will we have enough? Well, right now, that's not a concern really anymore. We have enough. We have many different types. And so because of the technologies that are now available to us, we still have coal if we need it. We still have the oil and gas if we need it. We have these newer renewable technologies that are available. We still have some hydro available to us. There are many alternatives. You need to pair the right one with the application specific need. But I don't see energy security as being that big a problem right now.
In terms of getting there, so to speak, there are various economic incentives that were used to reach these economic portfolios. And I'm thinking of a few more acronyms, three-letter acronyms, ITCs and PTCs.
That's 5 more bingos.
That's 5 more bingos. Especially during the time period, let's think of 2008 to maybe 2014. And I'm choosing 2014 because that was a time of fairly dramatic energy price fall. But what role historically did tax credits play, and what role do tax credits play today?
The PTC, which is a production tax credit, and is ordinarily thought about with respect to wind, although it does apply to other technologies as well, and the investment tax credit, which is thought of more being a benefit to solar. They are the people who take advantage of that more. Were big drivers, right. And especially in terms of getting the price down. So when we would have a solicitation, say when the utility would issue a solicitation for a resource plan, those prices were contingent on that developer getting either the production tax credit or the investment tax credit, and that could have an impact of as much as 30% of the cost to the utility, which is then passed on to ratepayers, of course, in terms of the price of that technology. So production tax credits for wind are now being phased out. That's, I think, a good thing. They were up and down for many years. Congress would renew the production tax credit for only a year or 2 years at a time, which caused a boom and bust cycle, or several boom and bust cycles in the wind industry. Finally, we've gotten to the point where there is now the last deal was a 5-year phase out, so the wind production tax credit goes away in a couple of years. I think that's a good thing, but if we're seeing bids for wind on the order of $18, $20 per megawatt hour, the question is, do you really need a $23 per megawatt hour production tax credit? So that's kind of an issue there. The investment tax credit, which is used predominantly by the solar industry, is also, I suspect, going to go away because solar prices have come down so dramatically. Solar prices have dropped more dramatically than any other technology out there. Wow. So they did their purpose. They served the purpose. They did it, and we're there. And I think, in terms of public policy, it's probably about time to rethink those things.
So many things have changed. The I guess an original driver, and I'm going back even farther, but in 2005, with regard to natural gas, I think there was a fairly famous Time magazine cover. The age of oil is over, and we have 30 years of natural gas left. And I'm not sure whether a geotechnical engineer could actually give you an accurate answer today in terms of what is available today, because that's changing.
That's true, and that you're coming back to the discussion of what used to be called peak oil,
right?
And then there's a peak gas, and frankly, you can peak anything if you really want to get there. The problem with peak oil was that it assumed a very narrow definition of what oil was. Oil was drilled in a conventional vertical well, not fracked, and so when Hubbard came up with the concept of peak oil back in the 1950s. In fact, that's what they were thinking. But we now have many other oil resources. You can frack it. Nobody talked about fracking and unconventional oil resources at that point in time. If you go even further, you can go into, probably would never get there, but you would get to oil shale. I worked in oil shale for what was then Atlantic Richfield back in the 80s. I don't know if we'll see it, but we have many.
We were in parachute and rifle building all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and I was supposed to move out there before Arcos sold the project to Exxon.
Right.
And Arcos offered me the chance to stay with them. I stayed with them. Exxon took it over. About a year later, they shut it down.
Black Sunday.
Yes. I'd like to think that they sort of learned after a year what we already knew, but
that's what strikes me most listening to you talk about this, Rich, and we don't have a ton of time left, is your command over a lot of related but diverse issues. And I think that translates to some of the education, energy education that you do. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you're involved in there?
I've been fortunate for the past several years to teach in 2 programs, one at the University of Colorado in Boulder and one at the University of Colorado at Denver. CU Denver has a Global Energy Management master's program that I teach in. I actually teach the first class in that program, so all the new students, much to their chagrin, come and have to go through my class. We go through the basics of coal, oil and gas, nuclear, renewables, electric vehicles,
biomass.
Biomass is the bane of the renewable energy industry, unfortunately, and all of those. And so we try to give them at least a well-rounded background in my class in that program for them to go further. I also teach up in Boulder. There's something called the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Initiative, and they have a certificate program and a master's program up there as well. I teach in that program. Just past semester, I taught an energy policy projects class and energy science and technology, and we cover, again, the same broad range: coal, oil, and gas, nuclear, renewables, and so on. I suppose it's, again, if you lived long enough and have had a chance to work in many of those areas, every one of those is something I've worked in at least for a little bit. So,
yeah. Well, it's a very Zen approach. You gather all this info, and then at some point later, it comes together if you're open to the possibility of it coming together.
I think that's a good way of putting it, yes.
Interesting. So what have you got coming up next? What are some of the projects that Rich Mignogna is working on?
Next week, I think Peter alluded to, I'm off to Germany. I also do a little bit of work in competitive intelligence, and I'm going to a conference there where I'm going to teach a workshop on technology forecasting. Wow. Which we started out this discussion with.
Well, I'm surprised a New Yorker got into competitive intelligence.
Well, don't assume that the wrong way. But again, it's part of, how do you acquire knowledge and data and use it in a strategic planning? And really, that's where much of the technology forecasting goes. You need to be able to look at where technology is headed to determine where you're going to make investments and what technologies you're going to deploy going forward. There are many options. So, for instance, electric vehicles are something that are talked. Well, electric vehicles are not going to take over the world tomorrow. I'm sorry.
Right.
20, 30 years down the road, 50% perhaps. But internal combustion engines are improving as well. And so how do you assess all of these options? And that's the kind of thing we deal with. How do you look at the trends in technology? How do you look at the markets for various technologies and compare them and see where they're all going so that you can make smart decisions as to where your investments are going to be?
Interesting. Rich, if people wanted to learn more about you, get in touch with you, where's the best place to find you?
There's a couple of places. Maybe the easiest one to find me is one of my technology forecasting website, which is temi.us. That's the shortest one. You can find me through the university and perhaps via email rm80401@gmail, which would be the easiest one as opposed to trying to spell my name.
And also, to learn about the seminar and workshop that you're giving next week, you can also go to www.competitive-intelligence.com.
Fantastic.
Yes, that's the conference in Germany, yes.
Yeah.
And you can find this episode on Vital for Colorado's website. That's Vital for Colorado spelled out .com. Go to the tab that says Learn, and then there's radio and podcasts. You'll find every episode that we've done, including this one with Rich Mignogna. Peter Moore, our chairman and CEO, also our host. Thank you, gentlemen, for being a part of the show.
Thanks a lot, John.
And thank you for asking me.
And you, everyone listening, have a great day. We will catch you in 2 weeks.